My name is Lexi Gill. I'm 35 years old, a sergeant first class in the United States Army. Most people say I was born to wear this uniform, but for 12 years, I played another role, Mark's wife. And that performance ended with a text message. I'm leaving you, it said. I'm going to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already cleaned out our joint account, haha. A moment later, my phone rang again. It was my mother-in-law. Before I could even speak, she launched into a tirade. Mark told me everything. Lexi, you need to take a good long look at yourself. You're too rigid, too obsessed with the army. A man needs softness, not a commanding officer in the house. It's no wonder he found that other girl. Her voice was like scraping metal, clawing at my ears. You pushed him away, Lexi. This is your fault. I hung up without saying a word. They both thought I would crumble. But they don't know that for a soldier, a surprise attack is just the signal to begin a long-planned counteroffensive. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you've ever been blamed by the people you love for their own betrayal. The air in my office at Fort Bragg was thick with the familiar smell of stale coffee and paperwork. It was the smell of late nights and early mornings, the scent of a career built on precision and dedication. Outside my window, the North Carolina humidity hung heavy over the sprawling base, but inside, the air conditioning hummed a steady, monotonous tune. I was leaning over the desk of a young private, my finger tapping a line item on his after-action report. You need to double-check Section 3B private, I said, my voice even. It was the same tone I used on the training grounds, the same one I used in briefings. Calm, controlled. The ammo count is off by 2 rounds. In our world, details are life and death. Yes, Sergeant, he mumbled, his face flushing with embarrassment as he quickly made the correction. Just then, my phone, lying face down on my desk, buzzed against the wood. A single, sharp vibration. I gave the private a nod of dismissal and waited until he'd cleared the doorway before I picked it up. The screen lit up with a notification from Mark, my husband. My finger swiped across the glass. The words appeared, stark white against a black background. I'm leaving you. I'm going to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already cleaned out our joint account, haha. I read the message once, then twice. The words didn't seem to connect. It was like reading a casualty report for a stranger. The final ha-ha hung in the air, a digital sneer that was more brutal than any profanity. My face didn't change. My breathing didn't hitch. I just felt a sudden, profound coldness spread through my chest, a silent grenade that had detonated without a sound. My only physical reaction was a slight narrowing of my eyes, the way a sniper squints when acquiring a target. The B-roll of our 12 years together, the awkward first date, the wedding at the Fayetteville courthouse, the arguments over his spending, my deployments, flashed through my mind, not with sadness, but with the cold clarity of an intelligence debrief. Before I could even process the full extent of the tactical strike, my phone rang. The screen flashed with a name that made my stomach tighten into a knot. Mother-in-law. Linda. I let it ring twice, a soldier's habit of giving the enemy a moment to reveal their position. Then I took a deep, steadying breath, the kind I take before stepping out on a qualification range, and answered. Hello, Linda. There was no preamble. No, how are you? Just the immediate launch of a coordinated assault. Lexi, Mark just told me, she began, her voice dripping with a cloying, false sympathy that was sharper than any knife. I just can't believe you let it get to this point. I told you, a man like my Mark needs attention. He needs to feel like a man. I stood motionless, the phone pressed to my ear, listening as she fired her volleys of blame. A wife is supposed to nurture a home, not be constantly worried about her next promotion. All that time in the field, running around in the mud. What did you expect? That little thing, Melissa, she works at his dealership. She looks up to him. She knows how to admire a man, how to make him feel important. Each word was a piece of shrapnel, tearing into the very insecurities Mark had spent years methodically cultivating in me. The idea that my service, my pride, my entire identity as a soldier was not a source of honor but a fundamental flaw in my character as a woman. He was lonely, Lexi. she continued, her voice rising with self-righteous indignation. You were never home. You pushed him away. This is your fault. The accusation hung in the silence between us. Your fault. The final definitive verdict from the family I had tried for 12 years to be a part of. I said nothing. There was no point. Arguing with Linda was like trying to reason with incoming fire. You just take cover and wait for it to stop. I disconnected the call without a goodbye. I didn't cry. Tears are a luxury you can't afford in a war zone. Instead, I walked with deliberate, measured steps back to my desk and opened my government-issued laptop. The familiar login screen appeared. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, typing in the URL for the USAA website. It was the bank for military members, a place of order and reliability. I entered my credentials. The main page loaded. My eyes went straight to the checking account line, the one we shared. The balance was displayed in stark, unforgiving numbers. $7.14. Enough for a large coffee at Starbucks. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. The ha-ha from his text echoed in my head. My jaw tightened. I scrolled down. There it was. Savings account. Lexi Gill. A separate account I'd opened years ago. A strategic reserve. It was where my re-enlistment bonuses went. It was where the rental income from the 2 small properties I owned near the base was deposited. My little monopoly project, as Mark had mockingly called it. I clicked on it. The balance was untouched, intact, healthy. A cold, hard wave of something that felt like victory washed over me. I opened a new message to Mark. My thumbs typed out 2 simple words. Good luck. I hit send. It wasn't a wish. It was a starting gun. My gaze drifted to the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. My hand moved on its own, pulling it open. Tucked in the back, beneath old field manuals and spare sets of dog tags, was a thin manila folder. I placed it on my desk. There was no label on it. There didn't need to be. I opened it. Inside were the assets I had been quietly gathering for the last 3 months. Copies of credit card statements showing charges for jewelry I never received. Hotel receipts from a business trip to Raleigh that I knew had been canceled. And on top, the single piece of intel that had started it all. A receipt from the Fayetteville Pie Company, a fancy, expensive place we had never been to together. A dinner for 2, paid for on a Tuesday night when he was supposedly working late. The night I found that receipt in his jeans pocket was the night my mission parameters had changed. I hadn't confronted him. I hadn't yelled or cried. Confrontation wasn't the objective was to prepare. A soldier never walks onto a battlefield unprepared. Linda's words came back to me. You're not soft. You're a commanding officer. I looked at the file, at the undeniable proof of his betrayal, and a grim smile touched my lips for the first time that day. She was right about one thing. I wasn't a soft wife. I am a soldier. And this is my battlefield. This war started a long time ago. That night, I drove back to the small 2-bedroom apartment Mark and I shared on post. The silence inside was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant, humming energy of the base. It was a standard-issue military housing unit, identical to hundreds of others, but it was supposed to be our home. Now, it just felt like an empty barracks. I walked through the living room, my boots echoing on the laminate flooring. A faint, phantom scent of pine lingered in the air, a ghost of the sad little Christmas tree we'd put up last year. That scent, once a comfort, now felt like an accusation. Sitting on the edge of our perfectly made bed, a habit from the army I could never shake, the memories began to surface, not as a flood, but as a series of cold, sharp snapshots from the past. The war hadn't started with that text message. It had been a long, slow campaign of attrition against my spirit, and I had the battle scars to prove it. My mind drifted back to last Thanksgiving. I had just come back from a 2-week field training exercise in the Uwharrie National Forest. 2 weeks of sleeping in the dirt, of constant rain, of being so bone-tired that my muscles ached with every breath. I'd driven the 6 hours back to Fort Bragg, taken the quickest shower of my life to wash off the grime and the smell of mud, and then driven straight to Mark's parents' house, desperate not to be late. I walked in the door, my hair still damp, my face bare of any makeup. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. Linda, my mother-in-law, was the first to greet me. She looked me up and down, her perfectly lipsticked mouth twisting into a tight little frown. "Well, look at you," she'd said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the living room to hear. "You look like you just crawled out of a foxhole. You could have at least put on a little lipstick, Lexi. It's Thanksgiving, for heaven's sake." A flush of shame and anger burned my cheeks. I had just spent 2 weeks serving my country, pushed my body to its absolute limit, and all she saw was a woman who hadn't tried hard enough to be pretty. A moment later, Mark strolled in behind me. In his hand, he held a $20 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon he'd picked up from the grocery store. "Mark, you're here!" his father boomed. The room erupted in cheers. He was hugged, his back was slapped. He was the hero of the hour for bringing a bottle of wine. I, who had driven 6 hours through traffic just to be there, just to be part of the family, faded into the wallpaper. I was just the tired, plain accessory on the hero's arm. That was the theme of our marriage. My efforts were invisible, his were celebrated. I remembered the early days when I'd received my first significant re-enlistment bonus. I was so excited. I spent weeks researching real estate, poring over financial reports, and finally found a small, run-down house near the base that I knew I could flip into a profitable rental property. I laid out the entire plan for Mark one evening, my voice buzzing with enthusiasm, showing him the spreadsheets, the potential ROI. He'd just smirked at me over the top of his beer. "Honey, that's cute," he'd said, his tone dripping with condescension. He called it my little Monopoly project. "Look, why don't you just leave the money stuff to the men? You focus on your, running around in the mud thing." The sting of that dismissal was sharp and deep. He didn't see a savvy, ambitious woman. He saw a child playing a board game. That was the day I made a decision. I went to a lawyer and, without telling him, formed my own LLC, a separate legal entity, a fortress. I was building my own defenses long before I even consciously knew I was under siege. My Monopoly project became my secret. The money I earned, the properties I acquired, they were mine, shielded from his condescending gaze. I thought back to our wedding day. A simple ceremony. He'd looked me in the eyes, his own shining with what I thought was genuine love, and he'd promised me. He promised he would always be proud of my uniform, of my service. He said my strength was what he loved most about me. That promise evaporated over time, replaced by a constant drip of complaints. "You have to go on another field exercise?" he'd whine. "Why can't you just get a normal desk job like other wives?" And his favorite, "None of my friends have wives in the military, Lexi." He wasn't just not proud, he was actively ashamed. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a prop. A pretty, conventional wife he could show off at barbecues, not one who could outshoot him at the range and had more medals than he had sales awards. The realization was excruciating, but it was also liberating. It wasn't my failure, it was his. But the final, fatal blow came about 6 months ago. The death knell of our marriage, it was at his dealership's annual awards dinner. I wore a black dress, something elegant and understated. I'd even put on the lipstick Linda was so fond of. I was trying. I was always trying. That's when I first met Melissa. She was the new receptionist, all of 20 years old with bright eyes and a bubbly, almost childlike energy. Mark introduced us. She looked me over with a wide, curious gaze, a look that took in my 35-year-old face, the fine lines around my eyes from years of stress and sun. Then she asked the question, so innocent but so utterly devastating. "Oh, it's so nice to meet you," she chirped. "Are you Mark's older sister?" Time seemed to stop. The clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, it all faded away. But the worst part wasn't the question. It was Mark's reaction. He threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. A laugh that felt like a physical blow to my gut. He didn't correct her. He just laughed. In that single soul-crushing moment, standing in front of his future mistress, he had erased me. He had stripped me of my title, my role, my identity as his wife. I was no longer his partner. I was just some older woman standing next to him. That was it. That was the moment I knew. Our marriage wasn't just cracked, it was dead and buried. If you've ever had your hard work or sacrifices completely dismissed by someone who was supposed to be your biggest supporter, please hit that like button. And in the comments, just type a simple, "I see you." Because for so many years, I just wanted to be seen. How could I not have seen this coming? The signs were all there, as clear as signal flares against a night sky. I just hadn't wanted to read them. His condescension became my shield. His dismissal became my camouflage. While he wasn't looking, while he was so certain that I was just a simple soldier who only understood commands and camouflage patterns, I began to build my own empire. The weekends became my main theater of operations. Mark's weekends were a predictable rotation of American leisure. Saturdays were for golf with his sales buddies at the Gates 4 Golf and Country Club, and Sundays were for collapsing on the couch, surrounded by beer and bags of Doritos, yelling at the Carolina Panthers on TV. I never begrudged him that time. In fact, I cherished it. It was the time I needed. It was my time. While he was lining up a putt, I was at the Fayetteville Public Library, hunched over a carrel in the quietest corner of the second floor. I checked out every book I could find on North Carolina's real estate law. I taught myself how to read market analysis reports, how to calculate cash flow, and how to understand the arcane language of mortgage agreements. The librarians started to know me by name. I was the quiet woman in civilian clothes who always smelled faintly of gun oil and spent hours taking meticulous notes. While he was screaming at a referee's bad call, I was driving my beat-up Honda Civic through the less glamorous neighborhoods surrounding Fort Bragg. I'd look for the houses other people overlooked. Small, boxy, post-war homes with peeling paint and overgrown yards. I'd park across the street and just look at them, not seeing the decay, but the potential. I saw the worn-out siding and imagined fresh vinyl. I saw the weed-choked flower beds and pictured neat rows of rose bushes. I wasn't just looking at houses, I was surveying terrain, identifying strategic assets. To him, it was my little monopoly project. To me, it was the construction of a fortress. Every number I punched into my Excel spreadsheet was another brick in the wall. Every hour I spent researching zoning laws was another layer of mortar. And when I finally used my re-enlistment bonus to close on that first small property, the feeling wasn't just excitement, it was security. The first signed rental agreement wasn't just income. It was a declaration of independence. It was a wall he couldn't breach. During the renovation of that first house, I met Mr. Hank. He was a retired Marine, a wiry old man with hands as tough as leather and a chest full of Vietnam ribbons he never talked about. I'd hired him to do the flooring, since that was one skill I couldn't teach myself from a YouTube video. The plan was for him to come in, do the job, and leave. But he kept finding reasons to stick around. He saw me, a young female soldier, up on a ladder in paint-splattered fatigues, patching drywall and wrestling with light fixtures. He saw the discipline, the refusal to quit. It must have struck a chord. "You remind me of me when I was a young buck," he'd said one afternoon, his voice a gravelly rumble. He started showing me things. How to properly cut in the edges when painting, the right kind of anchor to use for a heavy shelf, how to fix a leaky faucet. He never asked about my personal life. He just saw the mission, and he decided to help. More than the technical skills, he became a quiet sounding board. He'd listen. He saw the effort. "Don't you ever let anyone belittle your sweat, kid," he told me once, after I'd spent a whole day sanding down old kitchen cabinets. "The work your hands do? That's real. That's yours." He saw what Mark refused to. That this wasn't a game. This was my life's work. My other companion in this solitary mission came through the speakers of an old clock radio I kept in my cleaning kit. On the nights Mark was out for his late meetings, which I knew were just drinks with his friends or, as it turned out, dinners with Melissa, I had a routine. I'd lay out a mat on the living room floor, break down my service rifle, and methodically clean each component. And while I worked, I'd listen to Dave Ramsey. His folksy Tennessee accent filled the quiet apartment, a voice of reason in the chaos of my life. I listened to him talk about getting out of debt, about building wealth, about his baby steps. I followed them with the same discipline I'd learned in basic training. Live on less than you make. Invest the rest. No excuses. One night, I was reassembling the bolt carrier group of my M4 when Dave said something that hit me like a physical force. Financial freedom isn't about having a lot of money, he said. It's about having choices. Choices. The word echoed in my mind. That's what this was all about. I wasn't just investing in real estate, I was investing in my own freedom. I was building a future where I could make my own decisions on my own terms, without needing anyone's permission or approval. A future where I wouldn't be trapped by a joint bank account or a man who saw my ambition as a cute little hobby. The sacrifices were real. I remember one summer, a group of my friends from my unit were planning a long weekend trip to the Outer Banks. Beach houses, bonfires, a much-needed break from the rigors of military life. I wanted to go so badly, to feel the salt on my skin and just turn my brain off for a few days. But the money for that trip was the exact amount I needed for the down payment on my second rental property. I told them I couldn't make it. When Mark found out, he was furious. "Why are you always so cheap, Lexi?" he'd yelled. "You're missing out on life. It's just a few $100. He had no idea. He saw a missed vacation. I saw the foundation of my future. I just smiled a thin, tired smile and gave him the lie that had become my shield. "I'm investing in our future, honey," I'd said. It was a harmless lie, but it concealed a deeper truth. I was investing in my future. A future where I would never again have to depend on a man who looked at me and saw someone lesser. And as I sat there in that empty apartment, the silence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. Every quiet sacrifice, every weekend spent working while he played, every dollar I'd saved instead of spent, it had all led to this moment. The quiet, sweet satisfaction of knowing that when the storm finally came, I was standing in a fortress of my own making. For the next 2 days at work, I existed inside my fortress. I was efficient, I was precise, I was Sergeant First Class Gill. I ran drills, signed paperwork, and conducted briefings with the same unwavering focus I always had. But it was a performance. Inside there was just a cold, echoing silence. I was functioning, but I wasn't feeling. I was a soldier on autopilot. But some people are trained to see what lies beneath the camouflage. Master Sergeant Mike Rivera was my direct superior, a big, burly infantryman from South Texas who had seen 3 tours in Afghanistan. We'd served together for 5 years. He was a man of few words, but he had eyes that missed nothing. He didn't say anything on the first day. On the second day, during our morning intel brief, he noticed it. Not in my words, but in the white-knuckled grip I had on my coffee mug. In the way my eyes would glaze over for a split second, my focus drifting somewhere far beyond the situation maps on the screen. He didn't call me out. He didn't ask if I was okay. Later that afternoon, he walked past my desk, and without breaking stride, placed a cold bottle of water next to my keyboard. "You look dehydrated, Sergeant," was all he said before continuing on his way. It was a simple gesture, but it was an acknowledgement. He saw me. He saw something was wrong. At 5 o'clock, as I was packing my bag to leave, he appeared at my doorway, blocking the exit with his imposing frame. "Cook out," he said. It wasn't a question. "My treat. Heard they've got the watermelon milkshakes back for the summer." A lump formed in my throat. Cookout was the quintessential North Carolina fast food joint, the go-to spot for soldiers after a long day. It was cheap, it was fast, and their milkshakes were legendary. His invitation wasn't about the food. It was an offer of sanctuary, delivered without pity or prying questions. It was exactly what I needed. I just nodded. 15 minutes later, we were sitting in a worn-out booth under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the Cookout on Ramsey Street. The air smelled of char-grilled burgers and salty French fries. The whirring and clanking of the milkshake machine was a constant, oddly comforting soundtrack. I watched the teenagers behind the counter, laughing and messing around, and for a moment, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The easy, comfortable silence of 2 soldiers who didn't need to fill the air with meaningless chatter, He just let me be. He let me breathe. Then, as I was stirring my thick pink milkshake with a straw, he finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "All right, Jill, talk to me. What's going on?" And just like that, the dam broke. Under the harsh neon lights, surrounded by the smell of greasy food, I told him everything. I told him about the text message, the haha, the clean bank account. I told him about the phone call from Linda, her voice dripping with blame. I told him about the years of being made to feel small, about my Monopoly project, about being called Mark's older sister. I didn't cry. I had been trained too well to show that kind of vulnerability. But my voice cracked. It fractured in places, betraying the raw, ragged pain I'd kept locked down for so long. Mike just listened. He was a big man, with calloused hands that had seen combat. But he listened with a stillness and an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say, "It'll all be okay," or, "You'll get through this." He just let the silence settle after I finished, his dark eyes fixed on mine. Then, he said the words that I will never forget for as long as I live. He leaned forward slightly, his expression deadly serious. "He wasn't worthy of the uniform you wear." It hit me like a physical blow, but a healing one. It was a key turning a lock I didn't even know was there. All the pain, the shame, the years of feeling inadequate, it all just released. Because he wasn't looking at me as a failed wife. He was looking at me as a soldier, a comrade, a warrior. He was validating the one part of me that Mark and his family had tried so hard to diminish. In that moment, he didn't just offer sympathy, he gave me back my honor. He then told me about his own divorce, about how his ex-wife had left him while he was on his second tour, how he came home to an empty house and a mountain of debt. He told me how it was his platoon, his brothers in arms, who had pulled him out of that dark hole. "In the Army, we have a creed," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We never leave a fallen comrade. Mark may have abandoned his post, Lexi, but your squad is still here. I'm still here." Right then, sitting in a cheap fast food booth with a half-eaten burger in front of me, I finally understood. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who are willing to stand with you in the trenches. It's the family you choose, the one you earn. The shift inside me was immediate. The cold, lonely silence in my head was replaced by a surge of strength. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. My one-woman operation now had reinforcements. "I have a plan," I said, my voice steady now, the cracks gone. I told him everything, about my LLC, the rental properties, the separate bank account, the manila folder full of evidence I'd been collecting. I laid out my financial and legal strategy like I was briefing a mission plan. He listened intently, nodding along. When I was done, he gave a slow, approving grin. "Good," he said. "That's some solid prep work, Sergeant. You've established a defensive perimeter." He took a long sip of his milkshake, then set it down with a decisive thud. "Now," he said, his eyes glinting with a strategic light, "it's time to plan the counterattack." That night, I didn't just have a good meal. I found my commanding officer again. I found my brother in arms. And most importantly, in the reflection of his unwavering respect, I found myself again. The soldier was back in command. The conversation with Mike had recalibrated my entire mindset. I spent the next morning on the phone with 3 different family law attorneys in Fayetteville before finding the right one. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Anderson who spoke my language. The language of strategy, evidence, and decisive action. After our consultation, I no longer felt like a wife dealing with a messy divorce. I felt like a commander preparing a battle plan. The enemy had declared war. Mike was right. It was time to plan the counterattack. I didn't have to wait long. The enemy, it turned out, was about to walk directly into my line of fire. I was at home that evening, reviewing the retainer agreement Ms. Anderson had emailed me when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but a soldier's instinct told me to answer. "Hello? Babe?" The voice was sickly sweet, a syrupy, artificial tone I hadn't heard in years. It was Mark. My stomach churned. I could hear the tinny thump of club music and the chatter of a crowd in the background. He was calling from a bar. Of course, he was. "Hey babe, it's me," he continued, as if I wouldn't recognize the voice of the man I'd spent 12 years with. "Listen, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I was a little impulsive the other day. Things were said. You know how it is." I remained silent, letting him spin his web. My silence seemed to encourage him. He was used to me being quiet. He just misinterpreted what my silence meant. "We have 12 years together, Lexi," he said, his voice taking on a wounded, sentimental quality. 12 years. You can't just throw that all away over a stupid text message. Think about all the good times we had. Think about our home. Our home, the one he'd abandoned. The good times. The ones I now realized were built on a foundation of his lies and my willful ignorance. I analyzed his words like a communications intercept. This wasn't an apology. This was psychological warfare. Phase 1. Feign remorse and invoke nostalgia to lower my defenses. After a sufficient pause for his performance to sink in, he moved to Phase 2. The objective. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Things are a little tight right now. I'm having some cash flow issues. I was wondering if you could, just spot me a little something to tide me over. Just temporarily, until I get settled here in Miami. The deposit on this place in South Beach is no joke." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it almost made me laugh out loud. It was breathtaking. The man who had stolen our life savings, who had run off with a woman young enough to be his daughter, was now calling me from a bar in Miami to ask for a loan. He hadn't just burned the bridge, he was trying to sell me the ashes. This wasn't remorse. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was just sorry it hadn't worked out as easily as he'd planned. He was trying a different tactic, probing for a weakness he could exploit. The old Lexi, the one who always tried to keep the peace, might have caved. But that Lexi was gone. She'd been a casualty of war. I took a deep, centering breath, the kind you take before you squeeze the trigger. When I spoke, my voice was devoid of all emotion. It was as cold and hard as the steel of my service weapon. "Mark, there are 2 things you need to understand," I said, my tone flat and non-negotiable. The sudden shift in my voice clearly startled him. There was a pause on his end. What?" "First," I continued, enunciating each word with chilling precision, "you will never call me babe again. We are not on those terms. Second, any and all future communication from you will go through my lawyer. Her name is Ms. Anderson. You can submit your financial requests to her." Stunned silence. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to process this new reality. The music in the background seemed to get louder. "A lawyer?" he finally sputtered, his voice losing all its manufactured sweetness and shifting into pure, indignant rage. "A lawyer? What the hell are you doing, Lexi? Are you trying to ruin me? Is that it? After everything I've done for you." The victim card, the last resort of a desperate man who has lost control of the narrative. The anger that had been simmering inside me, cold and controlled, finally found its voice. But it wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, lethal question. "What have you done for me, Mark?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Let's review the record. You belittled my career. You were ashamed of me. You lied to me for months, maybe years. You cheated on me, and you stole my money. Our money. So, yes, you can talk to my lawyer." I could hear him starting to yell, a string of curses and accusations already forming on his lips, but he never got to finish. I pressed the red icon on the screen, severing the connection. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked down at my hand. It was trembling slightly. Not from fear, not from sadness. It was the aftershock of adrenaline, the physical release of a righteous anger I'd held in check for far too long. I walked to the window and looked out at the perfectly manicured lawns of the base housing. In the distance, I could see the faint lights of the training grounds where soldiers were preparing for battles of a different kind. I had just won my first one. I had established a perimeter. The enemy had tested my defenses, and he had been repelled. The war was far from over, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was the one in command. A week later, I was standing in the main ballroom of the Fort Bragg Officers Club. It was the hail and farewell for Master Sergeant Mike Rivera. He was being reassigned to a new post in Germany. The room was a sea of dress blue uniforms, the air filled with the respectful murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a sense of peace settled over me. This was my world. This was my family. I was surrounded by men and women who understood sacrifice, who valued honor and duty above all else. I felt a rare sense of pride, of belonging. The ceremony was beautiful. Speeches were made, plaques were presented. I was standing with a group of fellow NCOs, laughing at a story Mike was telling about his early days in the Army. In that moment, the chaos of my personal life felt a million miles away. And then the doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open. The sound was so violent, so out of place, that the entire room fell silent. Every head turned. And there he was. Mark. He stumbled into the room, reeking of cheap whiskey that I could practically smell from 50 feet away. He was wearing a stained t-shirt, ripped jeans, and a belligerent sneer on his face. He was a profane stain on a sacred canvas. A civilian shipwreck washed up in the middle of a naval fleet. Every eye in the room darted from him to me. In an instant, I became the center of 100 different stares. I was no longer Sergeant Gill. I was just his wife. "Lexi!" he bellowed, his voice a drunken, slurring mess that echoed in the cavernous silence. "I knew I'd find you here. You can't just ignore my calls and hide from me." He started lurching towards me, shoving past a bewildered young lieutenant. He was a man on a mission, and that mission was my public humiliation. I was frozen to the spot, my blood turning to ice in my veins. This wasn't happening. Not here, not in my sanctuary. He stopped a few feet in front of me, a wild, crazed look in his eyes. He wasn't just talking to me anymore. He turned and addressed the entire room, spreading his arms wide as if he were a twisted master of ceremonies. "Hey, everybody!" he shouted, a spray of spittle flying from his lips. "You all know my wife, Sergeant First Class Gill, a great American soldier." He paused, a sick, theatrical grin on his face. So great, in fact, she forgot how to be a damn wife. So dedicated to the Army that she'd rather sleep with her rifle than her own husband. A strangled gasp rippled through the room. His words hung in the air, obscene and poisonous. He let out a harsh, guttural laugh that echoed in the dead silence. He had done it. He had taken the very thing I was most proud of, the core of my identity, and twisted it into a cheap, vulgar joke in front of my commanders, my peers, and the young soldiers who looked up to me. I just stood there, paralyzed. My face was burning, a hot tidal wave of shame and rage washing over me. My ears were ringing. This wasn't a private matter anymore. This wasn't a phone call I could hang up on. He had breached the walls of my fortress. He had invaded my holy ground and desecrated it. He had attacked my very soul. Suddenly, Mike was there. He and 2 other senior NCOs moved with swift, silent efficiency. Each one grabbed one of Mark's arms. He was too drunk to put up a real fight. "Get your hands off me!" he screamed as they frog-marched him back towards the doors. "Lexi, you'll pay for this. You hear me? You'll pay!" The doors swung shut, cutting off his pathetic threats. The silence that returned was 1,000 times worse than the noise. I could feel the eyes on me. Not angry eyes, not judging eyes. Worse, pitying eyes, curious eyes. My carefully constructed perimeter had been annihilated. All my quiet strength, my silent endurance, had been for nothing. In their eyes, I wasn't a strong soldier anymore. I was a victim. A woman with a messy private life she'd dragged into their professional world. My silence hadn't protected me. It had only made me look weak. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at Mike as he came back to my side. I simply turned, my movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the ballroom. I pushed through the doors and into the humid North Carolina night. The chirping of crickets sounded unnaturally loud. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. The time for hurt was over. Something inside me had snapped, and in its place was a fury so cold and so pure it felt like ice water flooding my veins. It cleansed me of all doubt, all hesitation. He wanted a public war. He was going to get one. Total war. I pulled out my phone, my fingers steady. I found Ms. Anderson's number and pressed call. She answered on the second ring. "Ms. Anderson, it's Lexi Gill," I said. My voice was calm, clear, and completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice I used when giving orders under fire. "Sergeant Gill, is everything all right?" "There's been a change in strategy," I said. "We're moving from defensive to offensive operations, effective immediately. I want him served. I don't care what it takes. And I want you to file for an emergency hearing. We're not negotiating. We're not waiting. I want everything, Ms. Anderson, everything he's not entitled to. He just crossed the final line." This was my point of no return. If you've ever had a moment where you knew with absolute certainty that you would never, ever be silent again, hit that like button. And in the comments, I just want you to write 2 words. No more. Let's tell the world together. There's a famous quote by General George S. Patton. "Prepare for the unknown by studying how others in the past have coped with the unforeseeable and the unpredictable." My entire career had been about preparation. Now, I was applying that doctrine to a new kind of war. The next morning, at 800 sharp, I walked into Ms. Anderson's law office in downtown Fayetteville. The fury from the night before had cooled, hardening into something far more dangerous: purpose. The office, which had felt like a sterile consultation room just days ago, now felt like a tactical operations center. The war room. Ms. Anderson was all business. She had a conference table cleared, with a legal pad and a pen placed precisely at each seat. The documents I'd already provided were laid out in neat stacks, like topographical maps of the battlefield. "All right, Sergeant," she said, her voice crisp and sharp. She motioned for me to sit. Last night, the target revealed his position and demonstrated erratic, hostile behavior. From a legal standpoint, that gives us the strategic advantage. I nodded, appreciating her military-like precision. I opened my briefcase and placed the thin manila folder on the table. "I have more assets to add to the arsenal, ma'am." I laid out the credit card statements, the hotel receipts, the damning dinner receipt from the Fayetteville Pie Company. To this, I added the new intelligence, a list of names and contact information for the 3 senior officers, including Mike, who had witnessed Mark's drunken tirade and were willing to provide sworn statements. Ms. Anderson examined each document with the cool, appraising eye of a weapons inspector. "Excellent," she murmured, circling a charge for a diamond bracelet on a joint credit card statement. "Every receipt is a bullet. Every witness is a rifle. These are precise target coordinates, Sergeant. There's no ambiguity here." As we were mapping out the initial legal filings, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from a young specialist in my unit, a quiet kid who worked in the IT department. The text simply said, "Sarge, thought you might be able to use this. Check your email." I opened my email on my phone. There was a message from him containing a series of screenshots. They were from Melissa's Instagram account. Her profile was public. It was a goldmine of self-incriminating idiocy. There were pictures of her posing with expensive designer handbags, with captions like, "My baby treats me so good. Charles spoiled." There was a post with a booking confirmation for a boutique hotel in South Beach, with the caption, "Miami, here we come. Can't wait to get away from all the drama here." And the worst one, a selfie of her pouting, with a passive-aggressive caption that read, "Some old ladies just can't let go. Move on. New chapter." Most of the gifts had been purchased in the last 3 months, with Mark's credit card, our credit card. "Child's play," I muttered under my breath, disgusted by the sheer immaturity of it all. Ms. Anderson peered over my shoulder at the phone screen. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. "No, Sergeant," she corrected me gently. "This is not child's play. This is an unforced error from the opposing force. This is irrefutable evidence of intent, financial malfeasance, and alienation of affection. This young woman just made herself our star witness. We won't even have to subpoena her." The phone rang again. This time, It was Mike Rivera. "Just wanted to let you know I've already written my official statement," he said, his voice firm. "What he did was a disgrace. He can't disrespect one of my soldiers like that and get away with it. I may be heading to Germany, but I'll fly back on my own dime to testify if I have to." I was floored. "Mike, thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "We don't leave our people behind. Ever." An hour later, another call. It was Mr. Hank, the retired Marine. A friend of a friend who worked at the officers' club had told him what happened. "I heard about that little punk," he growled into the phone. "Listen, kid, I still have copies of every invoice, every contract, every check you ever wrote me for the work on those houses. If he tries to claim he had anything to do with building that business of yours, you tell your lawyer I'm ready to take the stand." As I hung up, I realized my army was bigger than I thought. It wasn't just a sharp lawyer. It was the quiet IT specialist. It was my commanding officer. It was the old carpenter who saw my sweat and valued it. It was a coalition of people who believed in me, who had seen my quiet, relentless work when no one else was looking. Ms. Anderson leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen on the table. She had a glint in her eye, the look of a strategist who's just found the enemy's critical vulnerability. "I have one more angle," she said. "His behavior at an official military function on military property could be considered a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, or of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces." "But he's a civilian," I pointed out. "He is," she agreed. "And the base command probably won't prosecute a civilian for it. However, the fact that his actions could be subject to investigation by the Provost Marshal gives us incredible leverage. The mere mention of the UCMJ in a civilian court will be a psychological grenade. It suggests his actions weren't just a domestic dispute, they were an insult to the entire institution of the U.S. Army." I nodded slowly, a cold sense of clarity settling over me. I finally saw the whole battlefield. This was no longer a simple divorce. It was an all-out campaign. We would use every legal document, every witness, every social media post, and every psychological tool at our disposal. The objective was no longer just survival. The objective was unconditional surrender, total victory. The Cumberland County Family Courtroom was a small, sterile room, but on that Tuesday morning, it felt as charged as a battlefield right before an assault. The air was thick with tension, the low hum of the air conditioning doing little to cool the animosity. This was the stage. This was the final showdown. Mark was already there when I arrived with Ms. Anderson. He was trying to look confident, decked out in a cheap, slightly too shiny polyester suit. But he couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes or the nervous way he kept adjusting his tie. He looked like a cornered animal trying to appear dangerous. In the back row, Melissa was hunched over her phone, her face pale, looking young and utterly out of her depth. She refused to meet my gaze. Then, I walked in. I hadn't worn my uniform. That was for my battlefield, not his. Instead, I wore a simple, well-tailored navy blue pantsuit. My hair was pulled back in a tight regulation bun. I walked with my shoulders back, my chin high, my steps measured and even, just as I'd been trained to do. My entire presence radiated discipline and control, a stark, glaring contrast to the disheveled desperation radiating from Mark's side of the room. I took my seat next to Ms. Anderson and faced forward, my eyes fixed on the judge's bench. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a single glance. The judge entered. She was an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a stern, unyielding expression. Her name was Judge Eleanor Vance, and a quick search by Ms. Anderson had revealed a crucial piece of intel. She had served for 20 years in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps. She was a veteran. She understood the culture. She understood sacrifice. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something beyond strategic confidence. I felt a glimmer of hope. Mark's lawyer, a slick man with too much hair gel, went first. He tried to paint a picture of a long-suffering husband, neglected by a cold, career-obsessed wife. He used words like abandonment and emotional desertion. He portrayed Mark as a man driven into the arms of another woman by loneliness. I sat there, motionless, as he spun his fiction. Then it was Ms. Anderson's turn. She stood up, calm and poised. She was a master of controlled demolition. She didn't raise her voice. She simply dismantled his entire case, piece by piece, with cold, hard evidence. Your Honor, she began, her voice cutting through the room. The opposing counsel speaks of abandonment. I'd like to present Exhibit A. She placed a printout of Mark's first text message on the projector. The words, "I'm leaving you. I've already cleaned out our joint account, haha," filled the screen. Does this sound like the heartbroken plea of an abandoned husband, Your Honor? Or does it sound like the gleeful boast of a thief? Mark flinched. His lawyer objected. The judge overruled it. Counsel speaks of a man driven to loneliness, Ms. Anderson continued, seamlessly moving to her next attack. I present Exhibits B, C, and D. She displayed the screenshots of Melissa's Instagram posts, the designer handbag, the Miami hotel booking, the smug selfie about old ladies. Does this look like a somber search for companionship, Your Honor? Or does it look like a premeditated affair funded by stolen marital assets? Melissa sank lower in her seat, her face turning crimson. Mark stared straight ahead, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Finally, Ms. Anderson said, her voice laced with ice, the opposing counsel asked for sympathy for his client. I present Exhibit E, a sworn statement from Master Sergeant Michael Rivera of the United States Army. She read from the statement, her voice ringing with authority. She recounted Mike's description of Mark's drunken, disorderly conduct at an official military ceremony, his obscene insults directed at Sergeant Gill's service and character. And this, Your Honor, she finished, placing the document down, is this the behavior of a man who deserves this court's sympathy? The room was silent. Judge Vance's eyes bore into Mark, her expression like granite. But the real knockout punch was yet to come. Mark's lawyer, desperate now, moved on to the finances. He made a claim for 50% of all assets, including, he said with a smug flourish, the portfolio of rental properties. Ms. Anderson waited for him to finish. Then she stood up and delivered the kill shot. Your Honor, my client objects to this claim in the strongest possible terms. I'd like to present Exhibits F and G. On the screen, she projected the articles of incorporation for my LLC, Gill Properties, dated 6 years prior. Then, she displayed the bank statements for the LLC, showing a clear, unbroken line of funding. My military re-enlistment bonuses and direct deposits from my personal Army salary. There was not a single dollar from Mark. Your Honor, Ms. Anderson said, her voice clear and powerful. My client did not just build a career in the United States Army. She single-handedly built a business. Mr. Gill was not a partner in this endeavor. He was not a shareholder. He was not even aware of its full extent. She paused, letting the weight of her words land. He was, for all legal and financial purposes, an outsider. You could have heard a pin drop. Mark's jaw was hanging open. He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. He had been so busy belittling my little monopoly project that he had never bothered to realize it was real. Judge Vance looked down from her bench, her gaze fixed on Mark. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only contempt. Mr. Gill, she said, her voice as cold as a winter morning at Fort Drum. You have displayed a staggering lack of respect, not just for your wife, but for the institution of marriage and for the military community she serves with honor. She didn't even look at her notes. This court hereby orders an immediate freeze on all remaining marital assets. You are ordered to repay the full amount you withdrew from the joint account within 30 days. Your claim on the real estate properties held by Gill Properties, LLC is summarily and completely dismissed. She picked up the gavel. Furthermore, I find your behavior, particularly your disruption of a military function, to be utterly reprehensible. Consider yourself lucky that is all you are facing today. The gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. Bang! Mark sat there, stunned into silence, his face the color of ash. I took a breath. A deep, slow, shuddering breath that felt like the first one I had taken in 12 years. It was the breath of a soldier after the last shot has been fired. The breath of a survivor. The battle was over. I had won. The crack of the judge's gavel was the final shot of the war. I had won. But as I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright North Carolina sunshine, I didn't feel the explosive joy of victory I had expected. There was no triumphant surge. Instead, there was just quiet. A vast, hollow, echoing silence. The adrenaline that had fueled me for months drained away, leaving behind a profound and staggering exhaustion. So, what comes after the victory? The cleanup. I got in my car and just drove, with no destination in mind. I drove past the familiar gates of Fort Bragg, past the strip malls and chain restaurants, until the landscape softened into pine forests and farmland. I ended up at Liberty Lake, a quiet man-made reservoir just outside of Fayetteville. I parked the car, got out, and walked to the water's edge. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees and rippled the surface of the lake. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. This was the first time in months, maybe years, that I had allowed myself to simply stand still. The battle that had consumed me, and the 12-year marriage that had preceded it, it was all over. It was done. And in that quiet, I finally let myself feel the loss. I didn't cry for Mark. I didn't miss the man he had become, or perhaps the man he had always been. I cried for the 23-year-old version of myself, the young, hopeful soldier who had stood at that courthouse altar and truly believed in his promises. I cried for the 12 years I'd spent trying to be good enough, trying to earn a love that was never really there. I was mourning a ghost. I grieved not for him, but for the years I could never get back. The days that followed brought the expected aftershocks. My phone, which had been blissfully silent, began to light up with a barrage of texts and missed calls. It was the last, desperate offensive of a defeated army. Mark's messages were a pathetic cycle of rage and pity. First came the threats, accusing me of ruining his life. Then came the begging. "Lexi, you can't do this to me. I have nowhere to go. My life is over." He painted himself as the victim, a man destroyed by a vindictive ex-wife. Then came the calls from Linda. The self-righteous anger was gone, replaced by a torrent of crocodile tears. "Lexi, please," she sobbed into the phone. "Have some mercy on my son. Think of the good years. You can't just throw him out on the street. It's not Christian." It was the same old playbook of manipulation, the same attempt to weaponize guilt and a shared history. But their weapons had lost their power. The words just bounced off the armor I had built. I read the texts and listened to the voicemails not with anger, but with a cold, detached clarity. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were only sorry they got caught. They were sorry there were consequences. I knew I couldn't just ignore them forever. An enemy left unchecked, even a defeated one, can still cause trouble. I remembered something I had read in a book by Brené Brown, a researcher whose work had helped me through some of the darker days. She wrote, "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." I needed to be kind. I needed to be clear. So I sat down at my laptop. I didn't text back. I didn't answer their calls. I drafted a single, concise email. I addressed it to both Mark and his mother. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a steady, unemotional rhythm. The letter was short. "Mark and Linda," it began. "The legal matters between us have been settled by the court. Any further attempts to contact me directly will be forwarded to my attorney. This is a final boundary. I forgive you both, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I wish you both well, somewhere far away from me." I read it over once. It was clear. It was final. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of sovereignty. It was the final document declaring my independence. I hit send. And with that click, I felt the last, heavy chain break. A few weeks later, I was in the produce section of the Harris Teeter, trying to decide between romaine and iceberg lettuce, when I saw her. It was Melissa. She looked diminished. The bubbly, arrogant confidence was gone. She was thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking every bit the exhausted 20-year-old she was. When she saw me, her eyes widened in panic. She immediately ducked her head and tried to steer her cart in the other direction. The old me might have felt a flash of triumphant satisfaction. But I just felt tired. I saw not an enemy, but another piece of collateral damage in Mark's path of destruction. "Hey," I called out gently. She froze, her shoulders tensed. Slowly, she turned to face me. "Hi," she mumbled, staring at the floor. I walked over, my cart rattling softly. "I just wanted to say, I hope you're doing okay." She looked up, and I was shocked to see her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For everything. He's not who I thought he was." A sad, knowing smile touched my lips. "They rarely are at first," I said. "You take care of yourself." I nodded, then pushed my cart away, leaving her standing there among the vegetables. That brief, strange encounter was a final, unexpected gift. It released the last vestiges of bitterness I had been holding onto. She wasn't my enemy. She was just a young woman who had made a mistake, another casualty of Mark's selfish war. And by letting her go, I was finally, truly, letting it all go. The war was over, the cleanup was complete, it was time for peace. 1 year later, I stood in a brightly lit classroom at the Army Family Support Center on Fort Bragg. The painful ghosts of the past year felt distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. I had been promoted. I was now Master Sergeant Jill. But on this day, I wasn't in uniform. I was wearing simple civilian clothes, a blazer and slacks. In front of me sat a room full of young female soldiers, some barely out of their teens, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. This was the first seminar I'd ever taught. I'd called it Operation Financial Freedom. I didn't tell them my story, not the messy personal details. That story was mine. But I gave them the lessons that story had taught me. I gave them the armor I had been forced to forge for myself. I put up slides showing them how to read their leave and earnings statement, how to open a thrift savings plan, how to start their own LLC. The greatest enemy of your independence is not a person, I told them, my voice calm and steady as I walked among their desks. It is a lack of preparation. The world will respect you exactly as much as you respect yourself. Build your own financial fortress. Know your own value, down to the last dollar. And never ever give anyone else control over your future. As I looked at their determined young faces, I realized this was what came after the victory. You don't just rebuild your own life, you help others build theirs. After the seminar, as I was packing up my laptop, a hesitant voice called my name. "Lexi." I turned. It was Linda, Mark's mother. I hadn't seen her since the court date. She looked smaller. The sharp, judgmental angles of her face had softened into weary lines of exhaustion. She was 10 years older than the last time I saw her. "I was just passing by," she said, clutching her purse. "I saw the flyer for your class." "It was a good turnout," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She wrung her hands. "I just thought you should know. Mark isn't doing well. After everything, his dealership did an internal review. They fired him for his relationship with Melissa. He's in a mountain of debt. He had to move back home with us." I just nodded, saying nothing. Her eyes filled with a familiar, weary sadness. "He still blames you, you know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He says you ruined his life." I looked at this woman who had caused me so much pain, and I felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, just a strange, quiet pity for a life spent propping up a hollow man. "No, Linda," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Mark ruined his own life. I just refused to let him ruin mine along with it." She had no answer to that. She just gave a small, defeated nod and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her. 2 years after the divorce, my portfolio had grown to 5 rental properties. I took a portion of the profits and established a small scholarship fund. I called it the Hank W. Kowalski Vocational Grant, in honor of the old Marine who had taught me how to fix more than just leaky faucets. It was for veterans who wanted to learn a trade, become a carpenter, an electrician, a welder. It was for people who wanted to build things with their own hands, to build something real. My grandmother used to read me a passage from the Bible, from Proverbs. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. For a long time, I didn't understand that. But now I did. I was no longer the invisible wife of a car salesman. I was Master Sergeant Jill. I was an investor. I was a teacher. I was the master of my own life. I had found a new, deeper joy in service, not just to my country, but to the soldiers, the young women who were walking the same path I had. 5 years. 5 years have passed since the day my old life burned to the ground. I'm sitting in my home office now. It's a room I built myself in one of my rental properties, which I now live in. On the wall in front of me, my military awards are neatly displayed. The Meritorious Service Medal, a few Army Commendation Medals, certificates of achievement. They are symbols of a life of service. But next to them, there is another frame. A small, simple, black frame. Inside it is not a medal or a certificate. It's a screenshot of a text message, printed on high-quality photo paper. I'm leaving you. I'm going to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I've already cleaned out our joint account, haha. I look at it now, and I don't feel the sting of betrayal. I don't feel the cold shock of that day. I smile. It's not a scar. It's a trophy. It's the first-place prize from the toughest battle I ever fought. It's the proof that the enemy's surprise attack, the one meant to destroy me, had accidentally triggered the most successful mission of my entire life. It was the starting gun for my own personal operation, Operation Dawn. And the dawn it turned out was beautiful. Thank you for listening to my story. If you're going through your own battle right now, please know this. You are stronger than you think, and you are not alone. The most important mission you will ever have is the one to save yourself. Build your fortress, gather your allies, and know your own worth, down to the last dollar. My dawn came, and I promise yours will too. For more stories of strength, survival, and sweet justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're building a community here, and we'd be honored to have you in our ranks.